Hello and welcome. This is your brain on drugs, and this is Punk Rock Psychiatrist. So today we're going to be starting off with the atypical antidepressants. And to be honest with you, I didn't quite know what the definition of that was. We know what typical and atypical antipsychotics are. I think everyone's pretty familiar with that. It's a pretty easy delineation with those. But what's a typical versus atypical antidepressant? And so I looked into this, and it seems that the typicals are MAOIs, TCAs, SSRIs, and SNRIs. Why? I tried to find something common to those four medications that these other medications did not have in common, and I couldn't find it. It's some suggested that these are the ones that increase the monoamines, but some of the atypicals increase monoamines. In fact, many of them do. Some suggested that these were some of the most traditional earliest ones, but there are some older medications that fall on the atypical list. So it is what it is. And so I wanted to cover the typical ones first. We start with the MAOIs, went to TCAs, then SSRIs, and then SNRIs. And now we're going to go into the atypical category, and we're going to go through each kind of class there. So what are they? One of the tricyclics that I covered, trimipramine, is sometimes considered an atypical because it doesn't have any SNRI capability like the other tricyclics do. So that one could be, and we already talked about it, and it's an interesting med because it doesn't block the reuptake of serotonin or norepinephrine very much. It mostly does other things, and I've never seen it used, and I'm not really sure what utility it has. So when we're talking about the rest of these atypicals, next would be the serotonin antagonist and reuptake inhibitors. That's Trazodone and Nefazodone. And then you've got the norepinephrine dopamine reuptake inhibitor. That's bupropion. Then you've got noradrenergic specific serotonergic antidepressant, mirtazapine, which is also a tetracyclic. We talked about it briefly when we touched on tetracyclics at the end of the tricyclic talk. And then we've got the serotonin modulators and stimulators. And I've read that these could be partially considered typical and partially atypical. This is vilazodone and vortioxetine. They're both basically SSRIs with a little bit of extra stuff added on. And with vilazodone, it's just 5-HT1A agonism. Vortioxetine's got a couple other things as well. And then we step into some of the really new medications. So the NMDA antagonists, the S-ketamine, and the dextromethorphan bupropion combo pill. And then the latest is gepirone, a 5-HT1A agonist. We've had that before, buspirone, but it's not an antidepressant. It's only approved for anxiety. Well, gepirone's the opposite. It's only approved for depression. So these are the next groups of medications that I'm going to go over. In today's episode, we're going to start with the first group. We're going to start with the serotonin antagonist and reuptake inhibitor, the SARIs. All right. So there are two FDA-approved SARIs. They're both phenylpiperazines. That's the type of chemical molecule they are. Trazodone is the first of the two. Its brand name was Desiril, and if you check out today's graphic, I have an old Desiril ad with me kind of staring at the eclipse there. But I don't know if you'll ever find Desiril anymore. I'm not even sure if Desiril is out there. So Trazodone is FDA approved for depression. That is all it is FDA approved for. It is pretty much, in today's day and age, never used for that. It's almost exclusively used as a sedative hypnotic, right? And if you remember back when we were talking about, the SSRIs, and I was saying, oh, let's look and see what the rank order of some of these meds were. And we had the SSRIs were some of the most prescribed substances. Well, Trazodone is pretty high up on the list. It's 18. So Lexapro 15, bupropion 21. So more popular than bupropion and less popular than Lexapro, escitalopram. So Trazodone is a very much highly prescribed medication. I have given it to tons of people. I don't give it to as many people as I used to, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And I'll bring it up again when we get into the insomnia series. So I haven't decided. Am I going to do ADHD meds next? Am I going to do weight loss meds next? That one's going to be shorter, so I might cover that one next. Or am I going to do insomnia? Those are the next, after we get through the depression series, those are the ones I want to tackle. And we'll talk about Trazodone again as a sleep aid, even though it's not FDA approved for that, and how it kind of compares to some of the other sleep aids out there, and why you might want to choose it as a sleep aid. But today we're going to be talking about it as an antidepressant. And I know it's not used a lot for that anymore, but I it is sometimes used, or at least as an adjunct. So we'll talk about that. So it came out in the early 80s. So this is actually, Trazodone is actually the first medication approved for depression that was not an MAOI or a tricyclic. It was the first. It was before bupropion. It was before the SSRIs. It was the follow-on to the tricyclics. And, when we talked about the tricyclics, there's a lot of problems. Big one is the anticholinergic effects. And so the drug manufacturers were looking for a medication that didn't have all these anticholinergic effects. It would be a little bit better tolerated. And Trazodone is what they came up with. And I think if you look at it in comparison to the tricyclics, it probably is a little bit better tolerated, but it's extremely sedating. And that's a big issue with it. All right. There used to be, now, if many of you that are out there that have prescribed this medication, you'll be familiar that when dosed as an antidepressant, it's dosed twice a day, BID. All right. And so that's why it can work as a sedating medication for insomnia, because it doesn't last all day. It can wear off, and then the patient could potentially function the next day. But when dosed as an antidepressant, traditionally is used as a twice a day med. Now, a while back in 2010, now Trazodone came out in 1981. In 2010, a long-acting Trazodone XR called Eleptro was released, right? And the idea here was that it was going to cause less sedation. However, 5 years later, in 2015, Eleptro was gone. So there is no more extended release Trazodone. Now, despite the fact that it has the shorter half-life, where it's typically dosed twice a day, it can be equally effective for depression if it's all taken at night. So I think hopefully that's new information to many of you. And I know you are all dosing it at night, so you can, rest assured that you may be getting some antidepressant effect from that when we dose it all at night. All right. And, an interesting point, when I elected to take a sleep medicine rotation during my psychiatry my fourth year of psychiatry residency. Sleep is so integral to what we do, but there are sleep specialists out there, and many of which, some of them come from neurology, but I would say the majority of them come from pulmonology. And when I was working with the sleep doc, when I told him about how much Trazodone that we prescribe people, he was very much like, if we're going to treat insomnia, we have to use FDA approved medications. And when I brought up Trazodone, he said, well, that's because you're using it as an adjunct for depression. You wouldn't just give that for sleep, right? And we do. However, most patients that I'm treating that are having sleep problems that are coming to me do have depression and anxiety. And so the Trazodone as an adjunct could be a good option for them. And, I didn't realize how potent it can be on those receptors at the doses that I've been prescribing. And so we're going to talk about that in a second. So this is some new information for me, and hopefully it's new information for you as well. So, but on that point, giving it once a day can be as effective as giving it twice a day. Now, when we're giving it for sleep, oftentimes what happens is, and I'm going to go into the sleep stuff later, but because it's used so much for this, I just want to tell you how I dose it for sleep, so you don't have to wait like 6 months until I get to those. So patients will often take these shortly before they go to sleep, hoping that it will work. It takes about 2 hours, sometimes 3. And often this grogginess that people get from it can last 10 to 12 hours after they've taken the medication. And so when patients come back and say, it didn't, it had they had issues with it where it wasn't working and it was lasting too long, I said, well, take it earlier. I have patients that take it at like 7:30, right? Like if it takes 2 to 3 hours to work, that's about the time you'd want to be going to sleep 2 to 3 hours after that. If you got to get up for work in the next morning. And then if you want it to wear off by the time you're like needing to function the next day, if it's about 12 hours, that's about 7:30 in the morning. So you may be getting up a little bit earlier than that, but at least it's wearing off sooner. So taking it early can be helpful. The other thing that I find that can help with trazodone is the idea of splitting the pill. So, it's kind of like, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. One pill of trazodone is not enough, 2 is too much, and 1.5 is just right. And so I find the 75 milligrams, like a 50 milligram pill, 1.5, that's often the dose that people find the most useful. And I'll do that with, other medications like hydroxyzine and things as well. So if something can be split, then it's often could be helpful to split. So this is one of the ones, and you could take 2.5, right? You could take half, you could take 1.5, you could take 2.5, right? So if you're in this situation where one is too much and one is too little, try and take something in the middle. And this is definitely one of those medications that you can split. So that's trazodone. And what is the other serotonin antagonist reuptake inhibitor? It's Nefazodone, brand name Trazodone. Now, many of you are probably not very familiar with this medication, and there's a reason why. So it's FDA approved for depression alone, just like trazodone. And whereas trazodone was developed to try and help with the, not have the same side effects, the anticholinergic effects that the tricyclics were having, Nefazodone was actually made quite a bit after trazodone, and it was developed to try and help with these adverse effects that people were getting from trazodone, specifically being less sedating. So trazodone's goal was to be a less anticholinergic than the tricyclics as an antidepressant, and Nefazodone's goal was to be less sedating version of trazodone, so less sedating and less anticholinergic. Both medications are not anticholinergic at all, which is great. Both are sedating though, but Nefazodone a little bit less. All right. However, something bad happened to Nefazodone. That grew concern that there was a risk of hepatotoxicity, which is people get toxicity in their liver, and the FDA actually had them put a black box warning, so the risk was deemed high enough for them to put that warning on there. We'll go over a little bit later, like how high that risk is. And so after that happened, the Nefazodone kind of fell out of favor. And in fact, its branded product, Trazodone, was removed from the market by the manufacturer, but generics are still available. So if you want to prescribe Nefazodone, it's out there. All right. And we'll talk about, when you might want to do that. So I think the most interesting thing about these medications is how do they work, right? What's the mechanism of action? And when we looked at, MAOIs are pretty simple. They block the breakdown of the monoamines, right? They inhibit the enzyme that breaks down the monoamines. The tricyclics, they have a bit more complicated. They could block reuptake of serotonin or norepinephrine. Some of them are alpha blockers, and many of them are anticholinergic. And then the SSRIs were, mostly just blocking serotonin reuptake, and then the SNRIs blocking serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake. Now the SARIs are a bit more complicated than that, and the trazodone versus Nefazodone, they pretty much block they interact with the same receptors in similar ways, but a little bit different. And I'm going to step through this in order of the receptors that they affect the most to the least. And there's a little bit of difference in there. Nefazodone might do one of these a little bit more than Trazodone, and we'll get into those details in a second. So the biggest thing they do is they block postsynaptic 5-HT2A receptors, right? They both do that. That is both of their primary, most potent thing that they do. So the 5-HT2A, that's a serotonin 2A receptor, all right? And what is the effect of that? That is the sedating effect, all right? So primary effect you're getting, when I actually look at kind of the chemistry of these, I don't see how Nefazodone would be less sedating than Trazodone, but apparently it is. I'm not sure how much, but once again, Nefazodone not used a whole lot. I've never prescribed it, so it's supposed to be a little bit less sedating. Another point here, when we're blocking these 2A receptors, remember when we talked about serotonin syndrome? The thought there is that's mediated by 5-HT2A, and so by blocking it, you may be, protecting against the risk of serotonin syndrome, be it that perhaps, like I said, we often combine these with other antidepressants because we don't give the higher doses that might give that antidepressant effect, and we're using lower doses to help with insomnia, and so they're often combined with SSRIs. So there may be some protection there against getting serotonin syndrome, and then they also, as the name implies, serotonin antagonist, so that and reuptake inhibitor, right? So they do block the reuptake of serotonin, but not to a very high degree necessarily. And then they antagonize some of the serotonin receptors, and the main one they antagonize is 5-HT2A, and that's also where the sexual side effects come from. So if you listen to the sexual side effect episode, you'll remember that the SSRIs, they increase serotonin everywhere, and one of the effects is that it causes sexual side effects. Well, with these medications blocking 5-HT2A, that's going to help us to not get those sexual side effects. All right, so these generally do not cause sexual side effects, and they cause sedation. Now, the next receptor is 5-HT2C. They both block this receptor as well. Nefazodone does it more than Trazodone. Now, weight gain could be seen from this. However, weight gain is not something we would typically see with these medications. Why might that be? Well, these two medications actually have a number of active metabolites, and I'm gonna cover those separately. But a big one is MCPP. That's a metabolite. They both have that metabolite, and that metabolite does quite a few things. One of the things it does is it agonizes 5-HT2C, and it does it more potently than these medications block it. And so this effect of 5-HT2C may be somewhat reversed by the metabolite that agonizes the same receptor. All right. So that may be why we don't see that weight gain. Next receptor on the list, alpha 1 receptors. They both block postsynaptic alpha 1 receptors. And this is not good because this can cause orthostasis, which is a drop in blood pressure upon standing. All right. So that's generally something that we would not want. I mean, we would never want orthostasis, but, and it's something the tricyclics did as well. So, we still had the improvement without the blocking of the muscarinic receptors, the anticholinergic effect, but we're still blocking alpha 1 with these. The SSRIs, the SNRIs, they don't block alpha 1. All right. Next receptor, H1. That's the histamine 1 receptor. They both block histamine 1. That causes sedation. Now we got like double sedation going on. We're blocking 5-HT2A and we're blocking H1. So that's why these medications are often used for sleep, particularly Trazodone. Now, next receptor, agonizing 5-HT1A. They both do that. Now this is where we think we're getting some of the antidepressant anxiolytic qualities. Now you may find this interesting, right? We've already mentioned 4 other receptors that they interact with more, and these are antidepressants, but we haven't got to the antidepressant receptor until the agonism of 5-HT1A. And if you're familiar with agonizing 5-HT1A, like buspirone and gepirone, you'll know that agonizing this receptor doesn't have a whole lot of effect on helping with depression. So still, we're not getting to the good effect of the antidepressants of these medications, right? So what's our next receptor down the list? All right, we finally got to it. Blocking presynaptic reuptake of serotonin. They both do this. However, they do it to a lesser extent than they interact with all the previous receptors that I mentioned. And this is where we're getting our antidepressant, right? This is what SSRIs do. This is what tricyclics do. It's what SNRIs do. And finally, it's what the SARIs do. But what's interesting is, even though they're increasing serotonin through the blocking of the reuptake of serotonin, they're blocking a couple of they're agonizing 5-HT1A. So that's getting increased by having the serotonin reuptake inhibited, but they're also agonizing that receptor. And then they're blocking 2A and 2C. So they're going to have a different effect than the other antidepressants that we've talked about up to this point. All right. And Nefazodone also blocks reuptake of norepinephrine and dopamine, which has antidepressant effects, right? That's what Wellbutrin does, bupropion. And now it's its weakest function. It interacts with those receptors the least on the list, but Trazodone doesn't do it at all. So a big difference between these two medications is that Nefazodone has some blockage of the reuptake of norepinephrine and dopamine, and Trazodone doesn't. Now, all those other receptors we listed, they both interact with those, but maybe one's a little bit more than the other one at one receptor or not another. So that could give a little bit different effect. But this is the main difference, is that Nefazodone does block the reuptake of norepinephrine and dopamine. All right. So that was a lot, right? That was a lot of receptors. And, I had always thought, and I just learned this when I was preparing this, I've had all this material for a while, but I'm trying to make it the best material possible for these podcast episodes. So I had always thought, low dose trazodone is what we use for sleep. And I've used 25, 50, 75, 100. That's the normal range. For some patients, I go up to 150, 200, 250. But generally after that, and the max dose is 300 twice a day, so 600 milligrams total daily. I think I had one patient on 400 once, and I've had a couple on 300. But what I was taught was that once you get up like around 200, you're not really getting much additional benefit on sleep. And so if they're not sleeping yet, it really is not helping to just continue to increase the medication. All right. On the flip side, as you increase the dose, you may have more antidepressant effect. And so if they're tolerating the medication and they're not groggy and sleepy from it, maybe there's some utility with increasing the dose further to help with depression, even though we haven't gotten the sedation that we were looking for. However, I recently read some information that kind of put some light on this, right? What I did not realize, so the 5-HT2A, that's the primary mechanism by which trazodone is a sedating substance. 50% of 5-HT2A receptors are blocked at only 1 milligram of trazodone. Now, the lowest pill size they make is 50, and I've had people cut it in half before, right? And the max dose, remember, is 600, but only 1 milligram, you're blocking 50% of those receptors. At 10 milligrams, you're like at 98%, right? You pretty much can't block anymore. And I mean, that's already lower than the lowest dose. So, the 5-HT2A is saturated at every dose of trazodone. That's why it's so potent at that receptor. It fills them up. And the thing is, this is kind of how this works, right? Once one receptor is filled up, then trazodone goes and finds the next receptor down the list. And remember, that's 5-HT, might be 5-HT2C more for Nefazodone, but maybe alpha-1 next or H1 next, right? So it's already kind of filled everything up by 10 milligrams on the 5-HT2A. And so what I didn't realize is when we look at the serotonin reuptake pump, 75% of those receptors are blocked at only 50 milligrams of trazodone, and at 100, 86%. And at these levels, you're pretty much, I mean, that's like SSRI levels, right? And I had always thought that trazodone needed to be dosed at much higher doses to give that antidepressant effect. Well, at 50 to 100 milligrams, because it's so potent at 2A and it's filling those up at like 1 to 10 milligrams, we're actually getting a lot of serotonin reuptake inhibition. And then 5-HT1A, you've got 90% of those filled at 50 milligrams. 5-HT2C, you've got 83% filled up at 50 milligrams. Alpha 1, 88% at 50 milligrams. And H1, 84% at 50 milligrams. And I mean, to me, this is kind of crazy because it's like, wow, at 50 milligrams and certainly at 100, we're pretty much maxing out trazodone. What's the point of even going up beyond that? And I think what you'll see is if you go up above 100, you're not getting a whole lot of additional effect. And the good news here is that if you're treating a patient with depression, maybe we don't need such high doses to have that effect. And remember, this is an old medication, 1981. The drug manufacturer has lost interest in this a long time ago. So who's looking into, this 600 milligram daily dose? That was set back in 1981. It has not been revised. Perhaps we don't need this high of a dose. And at the doses we're giving for insomnia, we may be getting quite a bit of antidepressant effect. And if we're not, perhaps that's because it doesn't work that well, right? It may be that it just doesn't work that well as an antidepressant. And so maybe you're thinking, well, the reason why it's not really helping as an antidepressant is because the dose is too low. Well, if you're up at 100, they may be getting a decent amount of antidepressant effect, but the reason it's not working could be one of two things. One, it could be that just trazodone's not that effective for depression. Or two, it could be that you're not telling the patient this is an antidepressant, because remember, a lot of the antidepressant effect of these medications is the placebo. And so if you're saying this is for sleep, that may be all they get benefit from. But if you tell them this is an antidepressant that could help with your depression and your sleep, maybe you're more likely to get some benefit on depression as well for that patient. Because often what we tell people is what they experience. And so, I think that's something I didn't really realize. And when I think back to the sleep doctor telling me that, hey, you're giving that as a depression adjunct, right? Maybe we should do that. And then I also wonder, might it be less likely that sexual side effects would occur if we're using trazodone, since it does block that 2A receptor, if we're combining it with a medication that does affect it. So, maybe we can breathe some new life into trazodone, or at least some new ideas, because we don't really use it as an antidepressant anymore. But maybe if we say, hey, this is actually an antidepressant and this dose could be effective, that maybe, the good old placebo effect will work for this as well. But, I have noticed that there are patients that seem to need higher doses to get the proper sedation. I have patients, like I said, I think 400 was the highest, and they actually found that dose to be more effective than the lower doses. So that's what every patient's different. These are averages, so, but maybe something new to kind of think about there. And another thing to think about are the metabolites. So MCPP, that's little m CPP. I think that stands for meta, and then I can't remember what the C is, and then PP is the phenylpiperazine. So remember, these are phenylpiperazine. So it's like meta, I don't know if it's cyclo or something like that, phenylpiperazine. That's what that stands for, right? So this is a metabolite of both trazodone and nefazodone. And it actually does a lot of stuff. So not only does it agonize the 5-HT2C receptor, which this is actually another place where you're going to get antidepressant effect, right? And so remember I mentioned, oh man, it's all the way down at 1A and serotonin reuptake inhibition, that maybe those are taking a while before those occur. But actually that MCPP, although it's not, it's not going to be at the same levels that the trazodone and the nefazodone are at, but that agonizing of the 5-HT2C receptor, that could actually give us some antidepressant effect. It could also help suppress appetite, and it also could help with the erection. So those are some things that are affected by 5-HT2C. And then MCPP also agonizes 5-HT1A. So nefazodone and trazodone agonize 5-HT1A, which has anxiolytic and antidepressant effects, but so does their metabolite, MCPP, right? It's also a relatively weak agonist of 5-HT3, which could cause nausea, though I've never seen nausea on this, so perhaps it's so weak that we don't really see that effect. Another interesting thing is it's also weakly a serotonin releasing agent. And does any of you out there can think of another serotonin releasing agent? We talked about this a little bit before when we talked about serotonin syndrome. So it's in it MDMA, ecstasy. So if you're on nefazodone or trazodone, it's possible that they could show a positive drug screen for ecstasy because of the metabolite MCPP has similar activity. And so it could be like a cross reaction of the drug screen because it's looking for that. Thinks they're on ecstasy, but they're actually not. So that's something, it's always important to know things like that so that people don't get into trouble. I remember a case of a guy that got in trouble for something in the military that he swore he didn't take and wasn't in his medical record. And we dug through it, and it wasn't me, it was actually a coworker of mine, dug through it and found that he was actually given in the ER, and it didn't show up on our record keeping system because the ER's notes were kind of different. And so we got him out of trouble, but he was almost kicked out of the military for that. So especially for you folks that are dealing with agencies or departments that might have that, doing those drug screens, knowing that, they could be positive is something that you would want to know. So those are all the effects of MCPP. Now, MCPP is the only active metabolite of trazodone, and the levels of it are at about 10% the levels of trazodone. Now, I don't know if that 10% level is a lot. Does that mean that MCPP has a lot of effect, or does it mean 10% levels, it's actually not that much? Maybe it's not going to have that much effect. So, I'm not sure. All right. For nefazodone, MCCP is actually found at 7% of the levels in nefazodone, so a little bit less. And as I said, it does the same things. Another thing it does is it's got a little bit longer half-life than nefazodone. Nefazodone also has to be dosed twice a day. And so the MCCP is kind of extending the half-life through what it does in a way. All right. But nefazodone actually has two other active metabolites that are found at higher levels than MCCP. And the first one is triazolidine. Let's see if I can pronounce this. Triazolidine. Triazolidine. There we go. Don't say this a whole often. Probably, those of you that are doctors out there are like, yeah, I wouldn't be able to pronounce it either. And the patients are probably thinking, this idiot can't pronounce this thing that they're giving me. So triazolidine. It is an active metabolite of nefazodone, and what's interesting, it's actually found at 4 to 10 times the levels of nefazodone. So much more of this shows up. It has effects on 5-HT2A and 1-alpha in similar ways to nefazodone, but it's got stronger histamine blocking, all right? And it has a much longer half-life than nefazodone. So those are some different characteristics. The other metabolite of nefazodone is hydroxynefazodone. It's found at 40% of the levels of nefazodone, and it affects 5-HT2A, alpha-1, and H1 similarly to nefazodone. So not sure that really, it kind of does the same thing. So maybe it's just like, you had more nefazodone. But you get a little bit, so when you just look at the parent compound, you may not see everything that's happening below, because some of those active metabolites do some different stuff. All right, so hopefully, this detailed information on the metabolites and how much of a receptor is occupied at different milligram doses of trazodone, this was newer information to me, and so hopefully that is to you, and you found that very interesting, like I did. But let's next look at the adverse effects of the SARIs. All right, so we've talked about this a lot. The sedation, trazodone, a little bit more nefazodone. And then also some other CNS effects, dizziness and confusion. That may be from the orthostasis. So orthostasis, also trazodone is a little bit worse than nefazodone. Hepatotoxicity, I have nefazodone a little more than trazodone, but I'm not aware that trazodone really has any hepatotoxicity. There's no warning on it. But this, I got some of my information from my slides for some universities, and that was what at UCSD where I got these original slides. It had said Nefazodone more than Trazodone, but I really don't think about hepatotoxicity with Trazodone at all. As I mentioned, Nefazodone has the black box warning, and you're probably wondering, how worried should I be about this? All right, so in the US, about one case of severe liver damage reported with use of Nefazodone for every 250,000 to 300,000 patient years. So a patient year is like, if a patient was on Nefazodone for 5 years, that's 5 patient years. Okay, so you would have to take all the years that patients were on Nefazodone and add all those different patients together, and you would have to have 250 to 300,000 of those before you get a severe liver damage case. That's not that common, all right? But if this medication was used a lot, this would probably crop up from time to time. And I think, there's other medications like valproic acid, which is being prescribed a lot less now, but only recently. There's other medications that are hepatotoxic out there that are used. I think this one probably fell out of favor because, I mean, how many antidepressants do we have? Like 40, 50? We have a ton. Do we need one that could possibly kill you through damaging your liver, even if it's like we'd need 300,000 patient years to do it? I mean, think about that. If you had patients taking this for an average of, I don't know, 3 years, it would take like 100,000 patients before you had one patient that had severe liver damage. But when the SSRIs are given to millions of patients, you would probably get hundreds, if not 1,000 cases or so of hepatotoxicity from Nefazodone. So probably not a risk that we want to take, kind of giving this en masse. But if you're looking at one individual patient in your office, the chances that this person gets hepatotoxicity is like 1 in 20, 30,000. Like it's super low. And so if for some reason you think that this is a unique medication, nothing else has helped, this one does work differently. I mentioned it has serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine reuptake inhibition. So sometimes the Nefazodone is referred to as an SNDRI. All right. And there's actually another one. Cocaine is an SNDRI, but there's actually one that's being researched right now that might be coming out. But it's the only legal SNDRI that's pretty much out there. And so it does have some unique qualities. And I actually worked with a pharmacist when I was a resident, and she was encouraging the use of Nefazodone. She's like, Nefazodone, it may help a certain kind of patient, right? So it works completely differently than a lot of other meds do. It works similar to Trazodone, but it's got less of the side effects of Trazodone. It has less orthostasis, less sedation, and a tiny risk of hepatotoxicity. So you might want to consider it for a few patients in your career, right? So don't completely write it off. It's not like levonorgestrel that I talked about in the last episode where I can't find any use for it because it pretty much works like a lot of other stuff, and there's no data that it can really help with anything else, and the company that makes it isn't even trying to sell us on it. Nefazodone, it's rarely used, but it may have some place. And so the liver toxicity is really, really uncommon. And what you can always do for that is you're definitely going to get baseline LFTs on this medication, liver function tests, and monitor them periodically throughout therapy. And then warn the patients for what the signs and symptoms of hepatotoxicity are, right? So that way we can catch it early, and maybe we're checking tests. So if you've got a patient that you think is uniquely, maybe this would be something to try on them, just check their liver function tests and tell them the functions, what to look out for, and have them come in if they're having some concerning symptoms, So I would not write this med completely off, but because of that black box warning, and like I said, valproic acid, I think it's got a black box warning on this, and people prescribe that, and I think it may even be more common. So not necessarily a reason not to do Nefazodone ever. Okay. Next side effect, priapism. All right. Most physicians know what that is, but what it is an erection that doesn't go away. Once again, Trazodone has greater risk than Nefazodone. And remember, a lot of those ways that we're interacting with the receptors actually help with sexual side effects. Well, they may be also helping too much, right? So, and there's certain, and this can be dangerous. There's probably male patients out there that are laughing, thinking, I wouldn't mind if I had an erection that wouldn't go away, but there's risk to this, okay? And there are some patients that we're more concerned about it than others, right? So, patients with sickle cell anemia, leukemia, hypercoagulable states, uh, patients that are using cocaine, methamphetamines. So those, not a lot of people have that, but they're at higher risk of getting priapism if they take one of these medications. And if you're getting frequent morning erections, which, most men do get erections in the morning, but if you're noticing that that is maybe lasting a little bit longer, a little more intense than it was before, that could be a warning sign that you might be at higher risk of getting priapism. I actually had a patient that they didn't get full on priapism, but they did tell me that they were getting a lot more erections, but only one. And you'll see why. It's not super common. Now, if you do get this and it lasts longer than 2 to 4 hours, you should go to the emergency room because, you're probably thinking, oh, well, this could be a good thing, but it's actually a bad thing. It can actually damage the penis, which I know that you don't want, right? So you're thinking this is a good thing, but it actually could cause the worst thing. You could damage it, and then you may have problems in the future. So erections longer than 2 to 4 hours, and that goes for pretty much anything. Not just if you took trazodone. If you have an erection for more than 2 to 4 hours, you should go to the emergency room because that's not normal. All right, and so once again, risk is higher than trazodone than nefazodone. So nefazodone really did. Unfortunately, it did. It's got a little bit more activity as an NDRI, and it's got less side effects, but it's got that black box warning for the hepatotoxicity. And is it really that much better than any other med? And and is it still really sedating? The reason why we don't use trazodone anymore is because it's so sedating. Nefazodone is maybe not as sedating, but it's still pretty sedating, and it can be hard to get through your day. This is the reason why we don't use the tricyclics. It used to be all we had, and some people might think, oh, I'd rather the person be sedated than kill themselves. Maybe they need to be sedated a little bit, but in today's day and age, we have other options. We don't need to sedate our patients constantly, and so we do not. One more adverse effect to talk about: anxiety and panic attacks. So MCPP, the metabolite, because of that 5-HT2C agonism, that can lead to anxiety and panic attacks. And there is a way in which that can become worse, and that is if you take it with a 2D6 inhibitor. So moving on to our next slide, drug interactions. So MCCP is a 2D6 substrate. And so if you're taking a 2D6 inhibitor, so maybe a Prozac, right? You're on Prozac, you're on Wellbutrin. Especially with Wellbutrin, it can make it difficult to sleep. You add trazodone to help them sleep. You've got the 2D6 inhibitor. You've slowed the metabolism of the MCPP. It rapidly accumulates and causes anxiety and dysphoria. So maybe you thought that it was the bupropion Wellbutrin that was causing the anxiety because that's, a well-known adverse effect. It could be the trazodone, and you're thinking, trazodone's sedating. It's not going to make somebody anxious. Wellbutrin makes people anxious. But if you inhibit the 2D6, the MCPP accumulates, that could cause anxiety and panic attacks. So not only do we need to think about what the substrate is of trazodone and nefazodone in case we're inhibiting that enzyme, we also have to think about the enzyme that metabolizes the metabolite of trazodone and nefazodone. Hopefully that made sense to you, right? So trazodone is a 3A4 substrate. So if you take a 3A4 inhibitor with it, it increases the level of trazodone. You could get someone could be extra sleepy. And that's like grapefruit juice, right? So grapefruit juice is a 3A4 inhibitor. And so if you take it with trazodone, you could get extra sleepy. But if you're taking a 2D6 inhibitor, you actually raise the rates of the MCPP and you can get anxiety, right? So it's a couple of things to think about there. right? And you probably weren't thinking about anxiety with trazodone. You probably think, if anything, it's going to make them so sleepy they can't be anxious. All right. And here's another thing about nefazodone is it's actually a potent 3A4 inhibitor. All right. So 3A4 metabolizes about half the drugs out there. Nefazodone is a 3A4 inhibitor, and it's a potent one. So that's another bad thing about nefazodone. And then, because like I said, that could be like a lot of the benzodiazepines, estrogens, so like birth control, just tons of things. So that's why we have to check our drug-drug interactions. And then the last most of the drug interactions have to do with nefazodone being a 3A4 inhibitor, and MCPP being a 2D6 substrate that could be inhibited by others, and then serotonin syndrome. So MAOI inhibitors are actually contraindicated to combine. When I talked about serotonin syndrome, I listed a bunch of meds that I was not that concerned about, and I listed trazodone and nefazodone in that list because they're 2A, 5-HT2A blockers, but they are also serotonin reuptake inhibitors. I would say that they're lower risk, but probably not a great idea. I mean, how often are you giving someone MAOI? And then do you have to give them trazodone? You could probably give them something else for sleep, right? So maybe not an issue, but maybe not take the risk. All right, let's summarize. Now, this summarize, I'm going to do an advantages and disadvantages of the class, so trazodone and nefazodone together, and then the next 2 points, I'll do the advantages and disadvantages of trazodone and then nefazodone, and then that'll be the episode. All right. So, what are the pluses and minuses of this class of meds? So, in the advantage column, when we compare them to the tricyclics, which is what preceded trazodone, I mentioned that you're not going to get the anticholinergic effect. So that's the dry mouth, constipation, heart palpitations, dry eyes, lots of different things, right? The hot as a hair, dry as a bone, all that stuff, right? You're not getting that. And then remember how tricyclics, you don't have to take that many of them to have a death if you overdose. We don't have that problem with these. So, that was another thing the SSRIs did, but trazodone came first. So trazodone was the next great step forward that was kind of an improvement over the tricyclics. I'm not sure that it's more effective, but it has less adverse effects, right? And then let's compare these to the serotonin reuptake inhibitors. We have less GI effects, right? Because we have less SRI activity. We're mostly working through other receptors. So we have less GI effects. We're not really having sexual dysfunction at all. And the weight gain issue is not really happening with these. And so we've got some advantages over the SRIs. It can be helpful in patients with insomnia. I said that like 15 times. They're inexpensive because they're old meds. And if you've got a patient that didn't respond to an SSRI, and maybe they're a problem with they've got huge insomnia issues, hey, maybe this is a good choice. I've had patients, I've never started someone on trazodone thinking I'm going to treat their depression with this. I've never like you would just never do that. But I've had patients that I've treated their insomnia with this and thought, maybe as an adjunct to something else they're on, this could help with depression. And we ended up getting to such a high dose that perhaps it does help as an antidepressant. So usually you're not going to pick this as like, oh, the SSRI didn't work, let's try this. It's more like you're adding it on for sleep, and then maybe you're getting the benefit. All right. What are the disadvantages? So the daytime sedation, right? The sleepiness it's the main feature with this. That's why we use these meds. That's why this is the 18th most prescribed medication. This is the most common sleep aid. There's lots of other sleep aids that might be good as well. This is a decent one. One of the big things I don't like about it as a sleep aid is that it tends to last too long. And what patients will say is that they feel groggy the next day. I've heard several patients have said, I feel like I was hit by a truck. That is a common comment I've gotten. So even, and as you get to higher doses, that sedation could get a little worse because, we're also blocking H1. So we're getting the double sedation there. So the problem is if you're trying to use it as an antidepressant, they can't tolerate the daytime sedation. And even if you're using it for sleep, they still may, Some patients it wears off in 10 hours, some 12, and some tell me they feel like crap all day. To those patients, I say lower the dose, but then the lower dose may not work, and then we scrap it. All right. So that is the biggest disadvantage with these is that the sedation is too much. The orthostasis, as I mentioned, we don't want people like getting dizzy and passing out from low blood pressure when they stand up. I've got dose titration required. I don't really consider that much, of a disadvantage. Um, and then priapism, which is a pretty low risk, could be a disadvantage. All right. So not a lot of disadvantages, but the big one is a big one. All right. All right. So let's talk about Trazodone, Desiril, 1981. Let's talk about what I like about it, what I don't like about it. So with Trazodone in particular, when I did my geropsych rotation, I noticed that they use Trazodone during the day in very low doses in patients with dementia, Alzheimer's, to help them with agitation and aggression, so that we try not to use the antipsychotics. There's a black box warning to not use psychotics in exactly this way. But sometimes if someone's just very violent and very destructive and you can't use anything else, we go to the antipsychotic. Well, one of the things that you could use before you go to an antipsychotic, and we don't like using meds that are sedating that are anticholinergic, like a Benadryl or something like that. We don't like using benzodiazepines because those can cause like delirium and things in the elderly. We don't like using the antipsychotics because they can and the reason what the black box warning is because they can cause cardiovascular events, right? Strokes, heart attacks, etc. Trazodone actually, doesn't have any of these risks. And I saw it used in very low doses, say 25, maybe even less, maybe 2-3 times a day, just to kind of help. So this is a good option. If you want to, if you're trying to, if you're going to have to use some sort of medication and you're wanting to avoid the ones with bigger risk, Trazodone may be a good option for that. Next advantage, you could use it in low doses during the day for anxiety if sedation is tolerated. So not just in your patients with Alzheimer's and dementia, you could consider giving it to other patients in tiny doses that don't cause sedation. It might help with anxiety. So that's something to consider. Another advantage, it doesn't cause the sexual side effects, the weight gain, the serotonin syndrome risk is lower, right? I mentioned that already. Um, there's also a lower risk of inducing mania. So in patients that have bipolar disorder, we try not to give them medications that are too serotonergic because it can induce a manic episode. Trazodone blocks a lot of serotonin receptors, and it's only a weak serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And so it may be an option for treating patients with bipolar that have some mood, anxiety, and sleep issues. So something to consider, that it's going to be less likely to induce mania than some of our other antidepressants. Another advantage, of course, the insomnia, and not just. And let's also talk about how it's not addictive, right? So this is not like Ambien or Valium or a lot of these more addicting medications for sleep. This one's not addicting. It's not habit forming, and that's why it's the 18th most prescribed medication, because it's a safe alternative to some of these other medications for insomnia, right? So it's not addicting, and we can use it for insomnia. But I've had tons of patients that love this medication for sleep, right? Um, I don't use it as much as I used to. It used to be like the only thing I went to, and you see a lot of patients that get the morning grogginess that we can't do anything about, and I start looking for medication that maybe have a shorter half life or work a little bit differently. Trazodone's still in my arsenal for sure. It may not be my first choice with every patient though. Like I have about 4 or 5. Doxepin's another one I like. Um, Hydroxyzine's another one I like. So maybe a low dose of mirtazapine. So there's several medications we can use for sleep that are not addicting. Trazodone's one of them. Um, but I would say trazodone, it might be a little more effective, but the problem with trazodone is that it lasts longer than these other substances. And so that's the issue. They get the daytime, it may work a little bit better, but they get the daytime sedation more likely. Now, another thing is, if you just take it once and you feel like crap, don't give up on it. I know you're going to want to give up on it. You're going to be like, I'm never going to take this thing again. I felt like garbage all day. But if you actually take it more regularly, after 2 or 3 days, you may notice that you become tolerant of that. And that might be a good reason to start lower. Maybe you started at 50 and you felt awful, go down to 25. And then if 25 was maybe not effective, stay with 25 for a few days just to adjust to it. And then maybe go back up to 50, see how you do. Right. So, I don't want to, just toss it out because we had one bad day. Often with medications, you have to take it a while before you get adjust to it. All right. So that's another advantage. And I've got one more advantage for Trazodone, is that it may have added antidepressant effect when used for insomnia as adjunct to other antidepressant. Right. So we already mentioned that as well. So, there's a decent amount of advantages to Trazodone. All right. What are the disadvantages? I've already pretty much gone over these two. So, very often not tolerated for depression due to sedating effects, the side effects of ataxia, intoxicated-like feeling groggy, orthostasis, and the priapism. And here I want to go into the numbers. So, 1 out of 6,000 to 8,000 men experience priapism on Trazodone. The early indication is a slowness to losing your erection when waking up. I mentioned, I don't know, before, for some reason I put frequent morning erections, but most men do have frequent morning erections. It's more like you have the morning erection and it's taking longer to go away than usual, right? That could be a sign that you might be at risk of priapism. And remember, if you get priapism, you can get treatment for it and it'll go away. And the fact that this only like I said, I've never had a single patient that I've ever given Trazodone to that had priapism that I'm aware of. I had one that maybe was having the slow loss of their erection, which is called detumnescence. So they had slow detumnescence, but they didn't actually get priapism. But I had that patient on inpatient, so I don't know what happened to them after that. But I did warn them so that they would know in case. So that's Trazodone. And then we're going to round off with Nefazodone. So whereas Trazodone came out in 1981, Nefazodone was much later, 1994. So kind of in the heart of when the SSRIs are coming out. It's around the time venlafaxine came out. The first SNRIs were coming out. Nefazodone is busting onto the scene. What are the advantages? So it's got the same advantages that I'm listed for Trazodone. It's got the same advantages, right? Compared to Trazodone, as we mentioned before, it's got less sedation, less chance of risk of orthostasis, and less risk of priapism. In fact, it's given so infrequently that it's hard to gauge how much risk there is with these because we just don't treat that many patients with it, but less risk of those. And then we may have that added benefit from the norepinephrine and dopamine reuptake inhibition. All right, so we've got more norepinephrine, more dopamine, and we're not getting that from Trazodone. So those are the 2 points that Nefazodone has over Trazodone. So what are the disadvantages that Nefazodone has that Trazodone doesn't? We already talked about the hepatotoxicity. The risk is really low, but may not be worth the potential benefit, as there's many other antidepressants that may work as well. If you're trying to get that norepinephrine dopamine reuptake inhibition that this is adding to the party, you could just give them bupropion, right? So, you've got them on maybe a Zoloft, and then you add a Wellbutrin to it. Why, instead of giving them Nefazodone, and then you're not taking the hepatotoxicity risk? So, it is a unique mix of what it does to different receptors, and there's probably patients out there that uniquely will benefit from that. On the last episode, I ragged on venlafaxine a lot because I hate it. But there's probably patients out there that it's unique kind of way that it does serotonin more up front and then norepinephrine. And maybe you get them on a higher dose and you get them to the dopamine reuptake as well. And just kind of that balance with the venlafaxine may work better than some of the other SNRIs. I'm not going to pick it first. I'm not going to be like, hey, this is the one I'm going to. But, it is slightly different, as Nefazodone has slightly different binding profiles than other meds. Maybe there's a patient out there that this is the med for them, but probably not worth the risk. You've got a lot of other options. All right. So after hepatotoxicity disadvantage, the potent 3A4 inhibitor, that's actually, to me, this is actually worse, right? Like, of course, if you get hepatotoxicity, that's worse, but it's such a low risk. Being a potent 3A4 inhibitor, that's bad. Half the meds out there are metabolized by 3A4. That includes meds that you buy over the counter. That includes some herbal things. That includes a lot of stuff. And so that includes meds they're going to get 5 years from now. That includes meds they're getting from some other doctor that maybe they didn't remember that they were taking and didn't tell you about, right? And so, do we want to increase the levels of all these meds that they may take? I generally try not to prescribe the medications that are strong inhibitors. Bupropion is one exception that I make because it is so unique. It is a strong 2D6 inhibitor, but nothing does what it does. And it's very uniquely effective. And it's what we're going to talk about in the next episode. I really, really like bupropion. You will find that out. And so it is the one strong inhibitor that, just because it can do so much that others don't, and it's so unique, that would be a reason to take a risk on it. With like a fluoxetine and a paroxetine, I generally try to stay away from them because of the strong 2D6 inhibition. We've got other meds that are similar that might be able to use. So when I've got the option of a med that's not a potent inhibitor, I generally like to go with those. And then also 3A4 is one that I really don't want to mess with. Like 2D6, there's a handful of meds that are metabolized by 2D6, but there are a truckload that are metabolized by 3A4. So when you're messing with 3A4, you're messing with a lot more meds. Another disadvantage of Nefazodone is the twice a day dosing. I'm not sure. You can combine the twice a day dosing into before bedtime with Trazodone. I'm not sure if that's an option with Nefazodone. I think it's a half-life is a little bit shorter, though. One of its metabolites is longer. But I mean, prescribing guidelines are twice a day. We don't use this one for sleep. We only use Trazodone, so you're not gonna, you find your way into Trazodone through sleep. You don't really, there's no real way to kind of find your way into Nefazodone. You're actually going to use this probably for its antidepressant qualities. Because if you were going to use it for something else, you just probably use Trazodone, right? And so because Nefazodone is not like widely used, it may not be easy to find. Every pharmacy may not carry it. And so big disadvantages: the hepatotoxicity, 3A4 inhibition, twice a day dosing, and not widely available. I've never seen it. I've never used it. I did have that pharmacist that sounded pretty positive about it. And so, but I mean, we just have so many other options that have so many less risks. It's just probably one you're not going to deal with. But it's all at the same time, it's very important to know it's out there in case you do see a patient. You want to know why. You may remember the hepatotoxicity. Do you remember the 3A4 inhibition? You want to know why we're concerned about it. And if somebody's already on it, I'm not going to want to change them if they're doing well with it. We've got the balance. Let's keep it, right? It's not broke, don't fix it, right? So you may inherit a patient on this, and you need to know what it is. So you may not start someone on it, but you may have a patient that's on it. So that's why I think it's important to know all the medications. It's just generally good practice. So I hope this was informative. I mean, I know these are two meds that are not commonly used. I know that for depression anyway, but Trazodone is used a bunch. And so I think knowing, even though I mostly was talking about its use as an antidepressant today, I did tell you about how we use it for sleep, but all the risks that are attached to it for depression, those are the same risks for sleep. But the risk on Trazodone, they're not that high. They're just not that bad, especially at the low doses we use for sleep. The main problem is that people are just too sleepy. I mean, that's the main issue, which is why we're using the first place, right? So hope you learn about the metabolites and all that good stuff. So next time we're going to be talking about one of my favorite medications. So I'm looking forward to this episode, and I hope you are as well. And maybe a lot of you out there, you think of bupropion more as a second or third line med. I want to pop it up into first line territory. I think throughout my career, I've actually switched over to using bupropion even more commonly than I use other medications. And we're going to find out why. So stay tuned. and I will see you next time.